I want to tell you a story of a mine disaster. This is something that happened in a very rich gold mine, very deep underground, one of the most richest mines in the world at the time when it comes to gold mining. It was a night shift. The people from the night shift crew were transported down the mine in big airlifts or cages as they call them, double-decker cage, and 104 people at a time can be transported down. They stopped at a level and people disembarked and started walking towards their workplaces. About 50 meters from the shaft gates, a supervisor saw a locomotive blocking a production line and he wanted it to be moved. So he turned around and said, "Are there any drivers, loco drivers here?" And a guy put up his hand and said, "Yes, I am one." So he said to this guy, "Move this loco forward for me." This was the first problem. This man was not permitted or trained to operate this piece of equipment, but he just wanted to help out. He started it up, and there's two switches there, an on-off switch and a dead man switch. The dead man switch is a spring-loaded button. You have to keep your hand on it to keep the loco going. If you release it, it'll cut out the power and it'll stop. When he started the loco up, there was a jerky movement which he was unaccustomed to because he's a diesel loco driver. This is a battery-driven loco. And he released the dead man switch. As he did this, he expected it to stop, but it didn't. It kept on going. In his panic, he jumped off and called the supervisor, but unfortunately the supervisor left. When this man turned around, he noticed and saw this loco engaging with a man carriage and pushing it in front of it towards the shaft gates. And it hit the shaft gates moments after a double-decker cage with 104 men had just gone past that level. It smashed through the gates and it disengaged the cable from the cages and it all plunged 500 meters down the shaft and killed 104 men instantly. When the manager of this complex was told that a locomotive had fallen down the shaft, his first reaction was, "But that is impossible." The reason he believed that that was impossible is because he knew how many safety devices had to be in place, were breached for this to happen. And he thought it's just not possible to happen because there are 10 layers of protection. I've already explained people being trained and permitted to use the equipment. Another protection they had was there was a sign that said no locos to be parked beyond this point unless the manager had given written permission. That rule had been broken. In this area, it's very difficult to park locos where there's no space around, so they often break the rule. But there were also a series of interventions that was going to stop this loco, stoppages that had to be in place. Now imagine a distance of 40-50 meters, and the first one that was supposed to be in place was the so-called farm gates. Farm gate had to be closed by rule on this day. Unfortunately, it was wide open and the loco and the man carriage was pushing through that. Then there was another stoppage. It was like a mall stopper. It's an RSJ steel bar plunged in a hole in between the two tracks. That was supposed to be in position. It would have stopped the loco. On that day, wasn't in its required position. Then they have what they call aeroplane sprags. Now these are basically two sleepers bolted together to form a wooden cross, and they are placed on the tracks and it would stop the loco. Unfortunately, that aeroplane sprag was not in its position. Neither was the backup aeroplane sprag that was supposed to be in position 15 meters from the first one. On this day, lying on the side, not stopping the loco. There was another prevention that was supposed to be working, and that's the so-called tank trap. It is a ditch that they cut through the tracks. It's about that wide and it's about that deep, and it's supposed to, if the temporary rails are not in position, it's supposed to catch the wheels of the loco. And the rule says the temporary rails must never be left in position. Unfortunately, those temporary rails were left in position and the tank trap didn't work. The last prevention they had was the shaft gates. Unfortunately, the shaft gates, the maintenance of it wasn't well done, and it was in disarray. The hinges were starting to rust, and it didn't stop the loco from running through and the man carriage. The very first device that should have stopped this accident from happening was the dead man switch. Why did the dead man switch not work? It was only when the loco was retrieved from underground that they found that the dead man switch was bridged out with copper wires. The drivers became tired putting their hands on it, and they organized with an electrician to bridge it out for them. All of these devices out of action in a matter of 31 seconds. Because if the cages were still coming down above that level, and this all happened, the loss of life would not have been what it was. In that 31-second window, all of these preventions were out of action, and the wrong man started up the loco. What are the odds of that happening? Impossible, but it happened. One of the tragic outcomes of this accident was an account of a young man who worked on one of the levels below, who said that he'd never heard anything like this before. He thought that the whole shaft was collapsing around him, and the cages and the loco and the man carriage momentarily got stuck right in front of him, and he could hear the men screaming inside. By this time, a few people had already been killed by the impact, and they yelled out to him to help them. He said, but there's nothing that he could do, and he could hear how the metal was shearing, and everything started to plunge and distort and fall away. And he said he would never forget the sound of those 104 men screaming at the top of the voice to him to help them, and there's nothing he could do. There was an enormous smash at shaft bottom, and then silence. Now these double-decker cages, they are big solid steel structures, 2 meters high, a double-decker cage system. All of that was crushed to 18 inches of steel and human remains in it. And the only thing that came out of there that looked human were the hands of these men, fingers, and the medical staff had to use their fingers to fingerprint to identify who they were. This is the most tragic example of failure in an organization. Failure not only of the systems, but failure of the whole culture, failure of safety management. And what is more tragic is if only one person that day had just stopped to look down and identify one of those safety devices out of action and put it back into place, this accident would not have happened.